Chapter 11. When she fights back. Sienna lasted 2 more days. 2 days of endless watching, endless taunting. Azuron's grip on her life was unshakable. He kept her close, never letting her out of his sight. But Sienna wasn't helpless. She was learning, and tonight, she was ready. The moment they entered his chambers, she struck. She lunged at him, aiming for the dagger at his hip. Azuron was faster. Before she could even reach it, she was already spun around, slammed against the nearest wall. Hard. His breath was ragged, his grip on her unforgiving. But his eyes, they were burning. Not with rage, not with amusement. Something else. Something dangerous. For the first time, Azuron looked truly unhinged.
"You are testing me,"
he murmured. His voice was too calm, too controlled. It sent a shiver down her spine. Sienna lifted her chin.
"What are you going to do about it?"
His jaw tightened. He took one slow step forward, pressing his body flush against hers. His fingers slid to her jaw, tilting her face up. His voice was pure sin.
"I will ruin you,
His lips barely brushed her cheek.
and I'll make sure you love every second of it."
Sienna's pulse slammed. Her fingers curled into fists, her body tense, trembling. Not with fear, with something far worse. Azuron let out a slow, sharp breath. Then, he let go, stepped back. Sienna stared at him, breathing fast, heart pounding. He smirked, turned his back to her, and just before leaving the room, he murmured,
"Keep fighting me, little wolf.
His voice was drenched in promise.
It only makes this more fun."
And then, he was gone, leaving her alone, breathless, furious, and more trapped than ever. Chapter 12. The monster's weakness. Sienna barely slept. She lay on the massive bed, his bed, staring at the canopy above her, still feeling the ghost of his touch, still hearing his words. "I will ruin you." She shivered. Not from fear, from something far more dangerous, something he wanted, and she would not give it to him. Her gaze flickered to the door. It was locked. Of course it was. Azuron's leash on her might have been invisible tonight, but it was still there. She turned onto her side, glaring at the dimly lit fireplace. Her body ached from how tense she had been, from how close he had been. Sienna exhaled sharply. Enough. She sat up. If she couldn't escape him physically, then she would find another way. There had to be something here. Something he didn't want her to know. A weakness. Sienna slipped out of bed, moving silently across the cold marble floor. Her eyes swept the room. The heavy mahogany desk. The shelves lined with ancient books and scrolls. And then, a cabinet. Sienna's pulse kicked up. She carefully pulled it open. Inside, she found maps, letters, and then a dagger. Not just any dagger. Its handle was worn, old, nothing like the elaborate weapons Azuron usually carried. This one had been used. A lot. Her fingers hesitated before wrapping around it. The second she did, a sharp sound cut through the silence. The door unlocking. Sienna's stomach dropped. She whirled around just as the door swung open. And there he was, Azuron, standing in the doorway, watching her, striking blue eyes flickering from her face to the dagger in her hand. Sienna's breath caught. For the first time since she had met him, Azuron looked truly, deeply furious. But beneath that fury, there was something else, something like fear. Sienna's grip on the dagger tightened.
"What is this?"
she demanded. Azuron didn't answer, didn't move. Then slowly, he stepped inside. The door closed behind him. His gaze never left hers. And then, his voice, dark as the night.
"Put it down."
Sienna's heart raced. He was dangerous right now. More than usual, but that only made her hold it tighter. Azuron inhaled slowly. His expression didn't change, but his hands curled into fists.
Sienna.
His voice sent a shiver down her spine. She squared her shoulders.
Why do you care? It's just a weapon.
Silence. A long, heavy silence. And then, he moved. Too fast. Sienna barely had time to react before she was pinned against the desk. Dagger wrenched from her fingers. Azuron's body was flush against hers, his breath warm against her cheek. His voice was low, controlled.
You do not touch this.
Sienna clenched her jaw.
Why?
Azuron didn't answer, but his grip on the dagger was white-knuckled, like he was remembering something he didn't want her to know. Sienna's pulse slammed. She had found it, his weakness, and now she just had to break it. Chapter 13. The Price of Disobedience. Azuron's breath was steady, but his grip on the dagger, that wasn't. Sienna saw the tension in his fingers, the flicker of something raw in his striking blue eyes, and she knew. She had just crossed a line, but instead of fear, she felt a slow, wicked thrill curl in her chest. Because, this time, he wasn't in control, and she wanted to know why. Sienna tilted her head, voice soft, dangerous.
What are you so afraid of, Azuron?
His body stiffened. A muscle in his jaw ticked. For the first time, he looked truly unguarded. Then, his lips curved, that cold smirk, the one that made her stomach twist.
Afraid?
His voice was velvet.
You think I fear you, little wolf?
Sienna held his gaze.
I think you fear yourself.
Something flickered in his expression. And then, he moved. The dagger clattered onto the desk as his hands gripped her waist, her wrists, her entire being. In a single, effortless motion, he lifted her onto the desk. Sienna gasped, fingers gripping the edge as Azuron stepped between her legs. Towering over her. Dangerous. Unshakable.
You want to test me?
His voice was low, dark, a challenge. Sienna's pulse slammed. Her skin burned where his fingers had touched, but she refused to let him win.
I want to know why this dagger matters.
Azuron exhaled slowly. His gaze dropped to the blade, still resting inches away. And then, he did something she didn't expect. He picked it up, turned it in his hands, like it was something precious. Not just a weapon, a memory. Sienna's chest tightened. Azuron was silent for a long moment before he spoke.
This was my father's.
Sienna blinked. He had never mentioned his family before. Not once. Azuron let out a slow breath.
He gave it to me when I was 13.
He turned the blade, watching it catch the firelight.
And the night I killed him, I used this very dagger.
Sienna froze. Her breath caught. Her stomach tightened. Azuron didn't look at her. Didn't react, as if he had just told her something mundane. But Sienna could see it now, the truth hidden beneath his indifference. This wasn't just about control. This was about punishment, atonement, for something that haunted him. Her fingers curled into the desk. She should have felt fear, should have been disgusted. But instead, she just wanted to know more.
Why?
She asked softly. Azuron finally looked at her. His striking blue eyes burned.
Because he was a monster.
A beat of silence, and then he smirked.
Much worse than me, little wolf.
He stepped back, setting the dagger down once more.
Now, go to bed.
A command, a dismissal. But this time, Sienna didn't feel like she had lost, because for the first time, she had won something far more important, a piece of him, and she would use it. Chapter 14. The game begins. Sienna didn't sleep. She couldn't. Azuron's words haunted her. Because he was a monster, much worse than me. She should have been terrified, but instead, all she felt was a slow, curling fascination. She needed to know everything. Who his father was, what had happened that night, and most of all, what it meant for her. Because if Azuron had truly been raised by a monster, What did that make him? She slipped out of bed, moving toward the heavy wooden desk. The dagger still lay there, glinting in the dim firelight. But she wasn't after the dagger. She was after the letters. Her fingers brushed over the old parchment, searching through the documents Azuron had so carelessly left behind. And then, she found it. An old, crumpled letter. The wax seal was broken, smeared. Sienna unfolded it, eyes flickering over the jagged ink, and her breath caught. The letter was from his father, and it said only one thing: "You will never be free of me." The ink was dark, heavy, and smeared at the bottom. It was blood. Sienna's stomach tightened. Something about this, about all of this, felt wrong. She pressed her lips together, shoving the letter into the folds of her dress. She didn't know what she was looking for. But she knew one thing. Whatever secrets Azuron had buried, she was going to unearth them. Chapter 15. Caught Sienna had barely turned when she felt it. A shift in the air, the sensation of being watched. Her pulse slammed. She didn't have to look to know. He was behind her, silent, waiting. Then, a single deep chuckle. Low, dark, dangerous.
Tell me, little wolf.
Azuron's voice was velvet.
Did you find what you were looking for?
Sienna's breath caught. Shit. He knew. He had been watching her the entire time. She forced herself to stay still, to stay calm. Slowly, she turned. Azuron leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, striking blue eyes glowing in the dim light. Unamused, but interested. She lifted her chin.
Maybe.
His lips twitched.
And did you like what you found?
Sienna clenched her fists. He was baiting her, testing her. She wouldn't let him win. She took a single step forward, voice steady.
I found a man haunted by his past.
Azuron exhaled slowly. Then, in a single fluid motion, he was in front of her. Close. Too close. His scent wrapped around her, suffocating. Sienna refused to step back. Azuron's fingers brushed her chin, tilting her head up. His voice was a whisper against her lips.
And do you think that makes me weak?
Sienna's breath hitched. She stared into his striking blue eyes, pulse hammering, and then she made her move, her lips curled.
No, I think it makes you reckless.
Azuron froze. His jaw tightened. Then, to her shock, he laughed. Dark, sinister, pleased. Then his hand was at her throat, not squeezing, not hurting, just reminding her that she was his.
Clever girl.
His voice was pure sin.
But tell me,
His grip tightened.
what do you plan to do with that knowledge?
Sienna's stomach twisted. She had pushed him, and now he was going to push back. Hard. Chapter 16. Bound to me. Sienna's pulse pounded. Azuron's fingers still rested against her throat, not tight, but commanding. A reminder that he was the one in control. Or at least, that's what he thought. She forced herself to keep her expression blank, even as his striking blue eyes searched hers.
What do you plan to do with that knowledge?
His voice was low, dangerous. Sienna lifted her chin.
Why? Are you afraid of what I might do?
Azuron's lips curved, amused, pleased, and then his grip tightened, just enough to make her gasp.
You think you're in control, little wolf?
His voice was like silk, wrapping around her, pulling her in.
You forget something.
He pushed her back. Not roughly, but firmly, until the backs of her knees hit the edge of the bed. Her breath caught. Azuron leaned down, his hands bracketing her on either side. Close. Too close.
I own you.
Sienna's body shivered, not from fear, from something much worse. Azuron watched her, his striking blue eyes flickering with something dark, something possessive.
Y'all think you can play games with me?
His voice dropped, his lips barely brushing her ear.
that you can dig into my past without consequence.
Sienna swallowed hard. She refused to let him see how he affected her.
I think you don't scare me as much as you want to.
A beat of silence, and then he laughed, a deep, sinful sound.
Oh, little wolf.
He pulled back just enough to meet her eyes.
That's because you don't know me well enough yet.
His fingers ghosted over her wrist, slow, deliberate, until he reached the pocket of her dress, where she'd hidden the letter. Sienna froze. Azuron smirked. And then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he slipped his fingers inside, brushing against her skin, taking his letter back. He pulled the crumpled parchment out, holding it between them.
Stealing from me. Now that's a mistake.
Sienna clenched her jaw.
I was going to return it.
Azuron's brow lifted.
Oh, before or after you read every word.
Sienna didn't answer, because they both knew the truth. Azuron exhaled slowly, then he stepped back. Just a little. Enough to let her breathe, but not enough to let her forget who was in control. He folded the letter, slipping it into his own pocket.
You want to know my past?
His voice was calm now, dangerous in a different way.
Fine.
Sienna blinked. He was giving in? No, not giving in. Setting a trap. Azuron's striking blue eyes gleamed.
You want to understand the monster you belong to?
He tilted his head.
Then you will come with him.
Sienna's stomach twisted.
Where?
Azuron smirked.
To where it all began.
Chapter 17. A lesson in obedience. Sienna expected him to leave, to let her stew in whatever plan he had concocted. But Azuron had other ideas, because the second she moved to stand, he caught her wrist, pulled her back against his chest. His breath was warm against her skin, his voice a promise of punishment.
But first, we settle this.
Sienna's breath hitched. His fingers trailed down her arm, slow, deliberate.
You disobeyed me.
He was making a game of this, but she knew better. This wasn't a game. This was a warning. Azuron's lips brushed against her ear.
And now, I'm going to remind you exactly who you belong to.
Sienna's pulse slammed. Her body betrayed her, heat curling low in her stomach. Azuron felt it, knew it, and he reveled in it. His fingers traced her collarbone. Light, teasing. Then, suddenly, he grabbed her chin, forcing her to look at him.
I see.
Sienna's lips parted.
Say what?
Azuron's grip tightened. Not painful, just firm, just demanding.
Say, Thate, you are mine.
Sienna's breath was ragged. Her thoughts tangled. Her heart screamed at her to fight, but her body was betraying her. Azuron's striking blue eyes burned into hers. He wouldn't let her go, not until he heard the words, not until she admitted it. Sienna swallowed hard, and then she made a choice. Her lips curved, and she whispered,
Never.
Chapter 18. The Broken Chain. Azuron didn't react at first. He just stared at her lips, at the defiance in her eyes, at her bare neck, and something in him snapped. His hand lifted not to grab her, not to hurt her, but to touch, to confirm what his eyes already knew. His fingers brushed against her skin, where the chain should have been, but wasn't. Sienna didn't move, didn't breathe. She knew what he had just realized. Shit. Azuron's fingers traced the absence. Slow. Lethal. Then he spoke.
Where is it?
Sienna's heart slammed. She forced herself to keep her voice calm.
Where is what?
Azuron's lips curled, not in Asmurk, in warning.
Don't, Sienna.
His voice was too soft, too controlled. And that was the danger. Because Azuron was never this calm. Not when he was angry. Not when he was on the verge of breaking something, or someone. His fingers scurled around her throat. Not squeezing. Not yet. Just reminding.
Where is your fucking necklace?
Sienna swallowed. She could feel his thumb resting against her pulse, measuring every beat. Every lee before it even left her lips. Her mind raced. She had taken it off weeks ago. Not because she had planned to run. Not because she had planned to betray him, but because she had wanted to feel like herself again. Like she wasn't just his possession. Like she wasn't just his little wolf in a striking blue cage. She should have hidden it better. Should have known he would notice. Sienna parted her lips, ready to come up with something. Anything. But before she could, Azuron moved. His hand left her throat, only to grab her wrist instead, and pull. Hard. Sienna gasped as she was yanked forward, forced against his chest. Azuron leaned down, his lips at her ear.
Tell me the truth,
He murmured.
or I will find it myself.
Sienna's breath hitched, because she knew exactly what he meant. He would search her. He would tear this room apart. And if he didn't find it, then he would punish her. Not with pain. Azuron had far better ways of breaking her than that. Sienna clenched her jaw. She wouldn't let him win. Not this time. Her voice came out steady.
I don't have it.
Azuron's grip tightened, and this time his voice wasn't soft. It was pure steel. Sienna barely had time to react before she was lifted. Azuron's arms wrapped around her thighs, throwing her over his shoulder. She let out a sharp cry, her fists pounding against his back.
Put me down!
Azuron didn't respond, didn't hesitate. He strode forward, out of the room, down the darkened halls of the castle, and Sienna knew she wasn't getting out of this one. Chapter 19. The Prophecy's Prisoner. Sienna fought against Azuron's hold, but it was useless. His grip was unrelenting as he carried her through the castle's winding corridors, deeper into the darkened halls. This wasn't just anger. This wasn't just punishment. There was something else, a storm building beneath his skin. Sienna knew it the second they left the main halls. The torches dimmed, their glow swallowed by shadows thicker than darkness. The air turned cold, and then she felt it. The strange pull of something ancient, unnatural, a force that wrapped around her like unseen hands. Her breath hitched.
Where are we going?
Azuron didn't answer. Not at first. Not until they reached the door. A massive thing of blackened iron. It should have been impossible to move, but with a single wave of Azuron's hand, the doors groaned open. And the second they stepped inside, the whispers began. Sienna froze. They were soft at first, like the wind brushing through leaves. But then, they grew, echoing from the shadows, calling to her. Azuron walked forward, taking her with him, until they stood at the very heart of the chamber. There, on the farthest wall, was something etched in stone, not just words, a prophecy. And beside it, a single, broken chain. One that looked exactly like the necklace he had given her. Her heart stopped. No, this wasn't just a chamber. This wasn't just a place of power. This was a tomb. A prison for something ancient, something dark. Sienna wrenched herself from Azuron's grasp.
What is this?
Azuron didn't move. His striking blue eyes gleamed in the low torchlight. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet.
This Iswi, you are here.
Sienna's breath came fast. Her gaze shot back to the prophecy carved into the wall. It was old, older than any language she had ever seen. But somehow she understood. Somehow, the words burned into her mind. The Ashen King shall rise again, but his rule will be unbreakable only if the blood of the moon binds him. The moon will bleed when the Ashen King has her in his hands, and she shall be his queen, both of power and pain. Sienna's hands trembled.
What does this mean?
Azuron stepped forward, closing the space between them.
You already know.
She shook her head.
No! That's impossible!
But Azuron wasn't listening. His fingers lifted, not to hurt her, not to punish her, but to trace the place where her necklace should have been, where it had once sat, marking her as his. A slow, dangerous exhale left his lips.
Do you know why I gave you that necklace, Sienna?
Her throat was too dry to answer. He didn't wait for one. His striking blue eyes burned, his voice a whisper of obsession, of truth.
Because at the moment I took it off, the prophecy would begin.
Sienna's stomach dropped. Azuron let out a low, bitter laugh.
And you just made sure of that.
Chapter 20. The truth. In ashes. Sienna staggered back. Her breath was coming too fast, too shallow. She wanted to speak, to tell him he was lying, that this was just another one of his games. But the moment she tried to step away, the shadows around them stirred. Not just darkness. Something else. Something watching, waiting. Then the whispers came again. But this time, they spoke. She is the blood of the moon. Sienna's heart slammed. The voice wasn't human. It wasn't from Azuron. It was from everywhere. Bound by fate. Bound by pain. She will either save the Ashen King, or be the one to destroy him. Sienna's hands shook. She turned to Azuron, demanding answers.
What the hell is this?
Azuron just watched her, unmoving, unrelenting. But there was something new in his eyes. Not victory, not smugness, something dangerous, something desperate. She does not know. The voices echoed, mocking. Azuron's jaw tightened. His hands curled into fists at his sides.
Enough!
The whispers vanished. The air in the chamber grew thick. Too heavy, too unnatural. Sienna could barely breathe through it. And then Azuron turned back to her, his voice low, unforgiving.
You are never just a captive, Sienna.
The words were a blade, cutting deep.
You were never just a prize, never just the spoils of war.
He stepped closer, and she couldn't move. His gaze burned into her, stripping her bare.
You were the reason I started the war in the first place.
Sienna froze. The floor beneath her might as well have shattered. She stared at him, horrified.
That's not true.
But it was. She could see it in his eyes. The truth. The same truth she had been running from since the night she was stolen away. Azuron didn't just invade her kingdom. He destroyed it. All for her. Her stomach turned. She shook her head, stepping back.
You're insane.
Azuron's lips curled. Not in amusement, in possession.
Am I?
He murmured. Sienna's entire body went cold. He had always been a monster. But this was something else. Something darker. Something obsessive. She turned away, her breath ragged. She had to think, had to process. The whispers, the prophecy, him. Everything came crashing at once. Then, she remembered. The stories. The ones her mother used to whisper when she was a child. The ones about the Veil's curse. And the blood of the moon. She gasped. Her mother's words came flooding back. The blood of the moon is cursed, Sienna. It is both the blessing and the end. If ever the Ashen King finds her, their fates will be tied. Until death. Or worse. Sienna whipped around. Azuron was still watching her. Waiting. Like he already knew what she had just realized. Like he had been waiting for this moment his entire life. She could barely speak.
You knew?
Azuron's striking blue eyes darkened.
I saw it.
Her breath hitched.
In the veil?
Yes.
A tremorin through her.
And you took me anyway.
Azuron exhaled, slow, measured. Then he closed the distance between them, not touching her. Not yet. Just enough for her to feel his warmth. To know that if she took one step back, he would follow. His voice was low, dark.
I will never let you go, Sienna.
She shuddered, not just from fear, from something far worse. Something she didn't want to name. Azuron tilted his head, studying her.
Do you feel it?
Sienna swallowed.
Feel what?
Azuron's lips barely moved.
The bond.
Her heart stopped. She wanted to say no, wanted to tell him. He was wrong, but she couldn't, because somewhere, deep inside her, she already knew he wasn't. Chapter 21. The Veil's Price. Sienna's breath came in sharp, uneven gasps. She needed to get out, away from him, away from the whispers that slithered through the air like unseen fingers, curling around her throat, pulling her deeper. Her heart pounded as she took a step back, then another. Azuron didn't stop her, didn't move. He just watched, like a beast waiting for its prey to understand. There was nowhere to run. Sienna's pulse thundered. No, she wouldn't accept this, wouldn't accept any of it. She turned, ready to flee. The world shattered, not in reality, but inside her mind. Her vision went black. Then, flames, fire, blood, screams. She was there, standing in the ruins of a kingdom that hadn't yet fallen. Her kingdom. But it was different. Wrong. The sky above was cracked, bleeding into shadows. Bodies littered the ground, some still moving. Their mouths opened in silent screams, their bodies twisting in pain as something black crawled up their skin, sinking into their veins. And in the center of it all, Azuron, standing at the top of the throne's steps, covered in ash, in death. But this wasn't the war she remembered. This was something worse, something yet to come. This is the future, blood of the moon. The whisper came from everywhere, from the veil, the same force that had shown Azuron his vision before he took her. Sienna clutched her head, gasping. No, this wasn't real. But as the bodies twisted, their soulless eyes locking onto her, a single, horrifying truth crashed into her like a wave. This was what would happen if she left. This was what would happen if she ran. Azuron's kingdom, his soul, would fall into ruin. And he would take everything down with him, including her. Her knees buckled, the vision collapsing around her in a rush of shadows. She barely had time to breathe before she felt him. Not in her vision, but here, now. Azuron's hands were on her before she could hit the ground, gripping her waist, pulling her against him. Sienna gasped, her fingers instinctively curling into his cloak. His warmth. It was the only thing anchoring her. For a long moment, she couldn't move, couldn't do anything but breathe him in. Azuron's voice came low, rough.
You saw it.
Sienna's body went rigid, because it wasn't a question. He already knew. Her breathing came ragged. She forced herself to pull away, to look up at him.